Kale Dravik watched the nurse move through the crowded streets of Novaria with practiced ease, weaving between pedestrians with a grace that seemed too deliberate for someone in her profession. His eyes narrowed behind the visor of his tactical helmet, fingers instinctively brushing the grip of the plasma pistol holstered beneath his long coat. He had hunted warlords, corrupt officials, and rebel leaders across the galaxy, but a nurse? It was almost insulting. Almost. His employers rarely gave explanations, only coordinates and a payout large enough to ensure he didn't ask questions. Still, something felt wrong about this job. The dossier had been thin. Her name, Ilera Voss, a medical worker at Novaria's primary hospital. No known affiliations with resistance groups or black market operatives. No criminal history. Just a woman tending to the sick and wounded. Yet someone wanted her dead badly enough to pay a fortune. Kale had seen high bounties on seemingly innocent people before. It usually meant they weren't innocent. He shadowed her movements, keeping a careful distance. The planet's capital, Ardent Spire, was a vertical city of gleaming towers and subterranean networks, where the elite lived high above the struggling masses. Ilera moved to the lower districts, where the air smelled of rust and synthetic food, neon lights flickering against the grime-streaked walls. She had no security, no visible weapons, just a medical bag slung over her shoulder, the long sleeves of her uniform concealing her arms. She entered a dimly lit alley, and Kale followed, silent as a wraith. The alley led to a side entrance of the hospital, an access door meant for staff. As she reached for the panel to scan her ID, he moved. He was on her in an instant, pressing the cold barrel of his pistol to her back. "Don't move." Ilera froze, fingers inches from the scanner. Her breath hitched, but she didn't scream, didn't panic. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough to glance at him. "I was wondering when you'd make your move." Her voice was calm, too calm. Kale had expected fear, pleading. Instead, there was a measured patience, like she had been waiting for this. "That's so?" he murmured, adjusting his stance, ready for any sudden movement. Ilera nodded slightly. "You've been following me all day. You're good. But I worked in war zones long enough to know when I'm being hunted." Kale's grip tightened on the pistol. War zones. The words clicked into place, a puzzle forming where there had been only fragments. A nurse, yes, but not just any nurse. A survivor. "I don't ask questions," he said, voice low. "I complete the job." "And yet," she said, tilting her head slightly, "you haven't pulled a trigger." Something about the way she spoke unsettled him. He had killed countless targets, men and women far more dangerous than her, without hesitation. Yet here he was, standing in the shadows of back alley, waiting. "Ilera Voss," he said, testing her name on his tongue. "Someone wants you dead." "I know." That stopped him. She knew? Kale had dealt with targets who were aware of their bounties before, but there was no fear in her voice, no desperation. It was as if she had expected this outcome. "Then you also know running won't help," he said. She exhaled slowly. "No, it won't." Kale had to admit, she was either the bravest target he had ever encountered or the most foolish. His finger hovered over the trigger, but something held him back. A whisper of doubt, a gut instinct honed from years of survival in the galaxy's darkest corners. Then she moved, not to run, not to strike, but to push back her sleeve. Kale's breath caught as he saw it. The tattoo inked into the delicate skin of her wrist. A phoenix, wings outstretched, entwined with insignia he had seen only once before. A mark from a past he had long since buried. The world around them faded. The neon glow, the distant hum of city life, the weight of his weapon in his hand, all of it became insignificant compared to that single mark. His heart, which had remained steady through every mission, now pounded with something he couldn't quite name. Ilera met his gaze, eyes searching behind the visor. "Now you understand," she said softly. For the first time in years, Kale hesitated. Kale stared at the tattoo, his mind racing through fractured memories he had locked away long ago. The phoenix entwined with the insignia wasn't just a symbol. It was a ghost from his past, a relic of a life he no longer claimed. The last time he had seen that mark, it had been carved into the armor of dead soldiers, Men and women burned to ash in a battle that was never supposed to happen. His pistol remained steady, aimed at Alara's chest, but the certainty in his grip had vanished. He had been a different man back then, before the war had chewed him up and spat him out as a weapon for hire. He had abandoned that world, buried it beneath blood and credits, but now it stood before him, alive and breathing in the form of a woman he had been sent to kill. Alara lowered her sleeve, the tattoo disappearing beneath fabric, but the weight of it lingered. She didn't move, didn't try to run. Her expression was unreadable, though Cale thought he detected the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. "You know what this means," she said. Her voice measured, but there was something beneath it. An old pain, a quiet grief. Cale didn't answer. He couldn't. "I remember you," she continued. "You weren't called Cale back then, were you?" His jaw tightened. That name had been buried along with the unit he had once sworn loyalty to. He had made sure of it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly. Alara sighed, a bitter smile touching her lips. "You're a good liar. You always were." Cale felt something twist in his gut. He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, severing any ties to the past. But now, standing in this alley with a woman who should have been long dead, those ties wrapped around him like a noose. He needed to end this. "Alara Voss," he said, forcing his voice back into something cold, impersonal. "You were marked for termination. If you have any final words, say them now." She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying the way a battlefield medic might assess a wounded soldier. "And yet, you haven't pulled the trigger." Cale exhaled sharply through his nose. She was right. He had never hesitated before. But this wasn't just another contract. What happened to the squadron? He found himself asking, the question escaping before he could stop it. Alara's expression darkened, and for the first time, she looked away. "The same thing that's happening to me now." The answer sent a chill through him. The Phoenix Squadron had been more than just an elite unit. It had been a secret weapon, a force trained for operations that no official record would ever acknowledge. They had been sent into battles that weren't supposed to exist, wars that were never declared. And then one day they were gone, wiped out. Cale had barely escaped with his life. And when he did, he swore never to look back. But Alara had survived. "You were a medic," he said, not asking, but confirming. She nodded. "I wasn't supposed to make it out." No one was. Cale's grip on his pistol tightened. He had always assumed the squadron's destruction had been collateral damage, an operation gone wrong. But the way she spoke, the certainty in her voice, this hadn't been an accident. Someone had wanted them erased. The same people who had now put a price on Alara's head. A sharp silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the city. Cale's instincts screamed at him to walk away. He had spent years perfecting his attachment, convincing himself that nothing from his past mattered. But now the past had bled into his present, and no amount of willpower could force it back into the grave. "They'll keep coming," Alara said quietly. "If it's not you, it'll be someone else." Cale knew she was right. Whoever had ordered this hit wouldn't stop until she was nothing more than a memory, another name scratched off a list. He should have killed her. It would have been easier, cleaner. But as he looked at her, standing there with the weight of an entire lost unit behind her eyes, he realized something he had spent years trying to forget. He wasn't just an assassin. He had once been a soldier. And soldiers didn't leave their own behind. Cale lowered his gun. Alara exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing only slightly. She hadn't begged, hadn't tried to convince him. She had simply told him the truth and left the choice in his hands. He holstered his weapon, the gesture final. "They'll come for me, too," he muttered. Alara's gaze met his. "Then we better make sure we're ready." Cale let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He had walked into this job thinking it would be simple. Now, he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The room was small, sterile, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Cale stood by the door, arms crossed, watching Alara as she rummaged through a cabinet filled with medical supplies. The low hum of the hospital's backup generators vibrated beneath his boots, a reminder that they were still inside enemy territory. It hadn't taken long to find an unused examination room where they could talk, but time was running out. If the people who had put a bounty on her life suspected she was still breathing, more assassins would come. Illyra set a datapad on the counter, its screen flickering to life with security logs and classified reports. She leaned against the counter, regarding him carefully. You really don't remember me, do you? Cale met her gaze, silent. He had been young when he was recruited, pulled from the wreckage of a life that no longer existed and forged into something deadly. The Phoenix Squadron had been his home, the only one he had known since war had taken everything else. But when the squadron fell, he had abandoned it like a sinking ship. Survival had come first. Looking back had never been an option. Illyra exhaled, as if reading the answer in his silence. I was there, Cale, when the squadron was betrayed. The name still sounded foreign to him, a relic of a man he had erased. But it was his name, whether he wanted to claim it or not. Betrayed, he repeated, the word heavy on his tongue. That wasn't an accident? She shook her head. No, it was an execution. Cale felt something cold settle in his gut. I was stationed at the forward medical base when the order came in, she continued. I wasn't supposed to see it, but the moment I did, I knew. They didn't just send us into an unwinnable fight. They planned for us to die there. Cale frowned, his mind working through the implications. Who gave the order? Illyra tapped the datapad, pulling up an encrypted file. The emblem of the Terran High Command flickered in the corner. It came from within. The same people who trained us, armed us, gave us our missions. They were the ones who pulled the trigger. Phoenix Squadron was too effective. We completed assignments no one else could, which meant we had seen things no one else had. And when we became inconvenient, they wiped us out. Cale's fingers curled into fists. He had spent years convincing himself that the squadron's destruction had been an unfortunate consequence of war. The alternative, that they had been sacrificed, was an uglier truth, one that threatened to unmake him. Illyra studied him. You weren't supposed to survive either. He let out a bitter chuckle. Guess I was just lucky. She didn't return the smile. No, you were targeted, just like the rest of us. The only difference is they lost track of you. You disappeared, changed your name. They assumed you were dead. His survival had been an anomaly, an oversight in an otherwise flawless purge. And now, by taking this job, he had unknowingly announced to the people who wanted him gone that he was still alive. Illyra reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial filled with a clear, shimmering liquid. This is why they want me dead. Cale frowned. What is it? A memory serum, she said. A prototype developed for field medics. It can recover erased memories, rebuild neural pathways destroyed by trauma, for suppression, even conditioning. She paused. I stole it. His eyes flicked back to the datapad. The encryption in the classified files, the hunt to erase her existence. All made sense now. It wasn't just about eliminating a loose end. It was about ensuring certain memories never saw the light of day. They destroyed us, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And then they buried every trace that we ever existed. I don't know what they were trying to keep hidden, but I intend to find out. Cale leaned against the door, arms still crossed. And you think the serum will help? She nodded. I've tested on myself in small doses. The memories come back in fragments, but they're real. The final mission, the details of betrayal, it's all there, buried in our minds. They didn't just want us dead. They wanted us to forget. Cale stared at the vial, his thoughts tangled. He had spent so many years trying to erase his past, to sever every connection to the person he had once been. Now, he was being offered a way to reclaim it. He pushed off the door. You said they'll send more. Illyra nodded. They won't stop until they're certain I'm gone. Cale exhaled. If he walked away now, she wouldn't survive the week. And if he stayed, he would be putting a target on his own back. He looked at her, really looked at her. She had been part of the same war, suffered the same losses. And yet, she had chosen to fight, to search for answers, to refuse to be erased. Cale sighed. Then we'd better make sure they don't get what they want. Illyra's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I was hoping you'd say that. The transport ship hummed beneath Kale's boots as he secured the last of their stolen supplies. The dim cargo hold was packed with crates of medical gear, weapons, and encrypted data drives, everything they had taken from the hidden lab before slipping past the station's defenses. It had been close. Too close. But they weren't dead yet, and that was something. Illyra sat on a crate nearby, her fingers wrapped around the vial of memory serum. She hadn't taken it yet. Neither had he. The knowledge trapped in their minds, the truth of what had happened to Phoenix Squadron, was dangerous. If they unlocked it, there would be no turning back. Kale checked his weapons for the third time, the familiar routine grounding him. They'll track us soon. We need to keep moving. Illyra didn't look up. And then what? He exhaled, leaning against the cold metal wall. That was the question, wasn't it? They had spent the last 2 days running, evading patrols, staying one step ahead of the people who wanted them erased. But survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. We take the fight to them, he said. She finally lifted her gaze, searching his face for hesitation. She found none. You want revenge, she said. Kale shook his head. No, I want justice. She let out a quiet breath, then turned the vial between her fingers. Then we need to remember everything. The weight of that truth settled between them. If they took the serum, they would uncover memories that had been forcibly erased, missions buried so deep they become nothing more than fractured nightmares. But they would also gain the one thing their enemies feared most. Proof. Kale took a step closer. We do this together. Illyra hesitated only a moment before nodding. She uncorked the vial, dividing the dose between them. The liquid burned as it went down, not physically, but in a way that made his mind pulse with something foreign and electric. Then the memories hit. Fire. Screams. A battlefield littered with bodies, soldiers wearing the insignia of Phoenix Squadron. The betrayal hadn't come from the enemy. It had come from above, from their own commanders. They had been ordered into an ambush. Their location leaked to ensure none of them survived. Kale saw flashes of encrypted transmissions, secret meetings, the quiet orders given to erase them all. And at the center of it, a name, a face. High Commander Regis, the leader of the Terran High Command, the man who had orchestrated their deaths. Kale's breath came hard and fast as the vision faded. He looked at Illyra, who clutched her head, her expression twisted with the weight of what she had just seen. They didn't just kill us, she murmured. They used us, experimented on us, wiped our minds when we got too close to the truth. Kale's fist clenched. Not anymore. He moved to the ship's controls, punching in new coordinates. Illyra blinked at the display. That's the Terran High Command Station, he confirmed. If Regis wants us erased, we make sure the entire galaxy knows what he did. She stared at him, then let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You really think 2 people can bring down an empire? Kale gave a grim smile. Phoenix Squadron took down armies with less. The engines roared to life beneath them. There was no going back. And for the first time in years, Kale Dravik felt like a soldier again,